Okay, without further ado, I want to first welcome everybody again to the Washtenaw County Democratic Party May General Membership Meeting. I am Loretta Codrington, the Vice Chair, Co-Vice Chair of Programs, and I want to thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us. Today we have 4 dynamic and dedicated individuals who will talk to us about workers' rights to organize, labor movement power, and the PRO Act. And so I want to introduce to you Ian Robinson, who is a Huron Valley Area Labor Federation president and also a University of Michigan faculty member. Without further ado, Ian, I'm gonna let you take it over.
Thank you so much, Loretta, and thank you to you and to the Washtenaw County Democratic Party for inviting us to be here on International Labor Day. Do I have the capacity to screen share? Yes, I do. Okay, great. So I'm gonna share some slides here. And the first thing I wanted to do was talk a little bit about, hang on, this International Labor Day. I mean, we have our day in September that we celebrate in the United States, but all around the world, you know, May Day, May 1st is the day that workers' struggles are celebrated in other parts of the world. And the origins of that, without going into a whole lot of detail, lie in Chicago in May 4th, 1886, when there was a massacre of workers who were rallying in support of a strike for the 8-hour day that a number of unions in Chicago were pursuing. The police attempted to break this up. A bomb was thrown. Who threw it was never actually discovered. That started the police shooting. Some of the people in the workers were armed as well. By the end of it, 7 police and 4 civilians, 4 workers were dead. Dozens more were injured. And that set off a roundup of union leaders in the Chicago area, 8 of whom were subsequently tried and convicted for conspiracy, and 7 were sentenced to death. And this set of events led to international mobilization and support of these workers in Chicago, these leaders who were sentenced to death. 4 were hanged. Another one committed suicide in prison rather than be hanged. 2 others had their sentences commuted when a new governor came in who was more pro-worker. But ever after that, May 1st has been the day when we commemorate workers' struggles for their right to organize, their right to engage in collective bargaining, their right to vote. In many countries, labor movement was at the heart of the struggle for the extension of the franchise to working class people, and of course, the right to strike. So I would like to start this portion of the meeting by taking a moment of silence for all the workers who have died in those struggles in this country and around the world. Thank you. So here is our plan for today. We've got an amazing panel that we were able to put together. I've already been introduced by Loretta. I'll just note that until yesterday, I was the president of LEO, the Lecturers Union at the University of Michigan. You can see the background. We're in bargaining right now. So I'm still very much involved in the negotiations and other aspects of LEO, but our new president, Kirsten Harold, took over today. So I remain the Huron Valley Area Labor Federation president, and I'm a lecturer in sociology in the RC. Our other 3 panelists are Cindy Estrada, the international vice president of the UAW, and someone who's began as an organizer in the UAW and continues to oversee organizing within the entire union at this point. I'll ask Cindy to say a bit more about herself when we get to her part of the event, but I'll stop for there. Then we have Sadatu Mamatrawil, who is a RDWSU research, retail, I got this wrong. Oh no, it's RWDSU. It's retail, wholesale, and Department Store Union, which is a union that's been around for a long time, one of the more progressive unions in our country. She was involved as an organizer in the front lines in the effort to organize the Amazon distribution center in Bessemer, Alabama. So we're going to ask Sadatu to talk a little bit about the kinds of anti-union strategies and tactics that were deployed by Amazon that, at least in this first round, were able to defeat the organizing drive there. And then finally, Kate Andreas, who is a U of M law school professor, teaches labor law at U of M, but is also a former organizer, so brings that experience to her work as a law professor and a lawyer, and is going to talk to us about how the PRO Act, which stands for the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, that has already passed the House, and we are going to try to get through the Senate in the next 6 months, how that would impact some of the kind of strategies and tactics that were used by limiting employers' ability to frustrate workers' efforts and desire to form a union, but also give us a little bit of a sense of what the PRO Act can't do, what other kinds of changes we need to make in our institutions and policies in order to fully realize the ideal that everyone who wants to be in a union ought to be able to be in a union. That's the spirit of the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, passed in 1935 as the core of the New Deal. And that spirit, we are so far out of line with actually realizing that spirit at this point that only 1 in 6 American workers who wants to belong to a union actually does. So we'll get into that. So we'll end with a couple of things that you can do in the next few days to support the PRO Act, and I'll keep people posted beyond today on other ways that can be involved, but there just happen to be a few activities happening in the next 3 or 4 days that I wanted you to be aware of. So that's the plan. What I'm going to do in my part of it is address 2 questions. First, why should you really care about the share of workers that are organized into unions? Obviously, the workers who want to be in a union care, but what about the rest of us? What's the larger at stake here for the impacts of higher or lower degrees of union organization in a country or a state? And then the second question, why has the share of US workers belonging to unions fallen so dramatically since the mid-1970s? So jumping right in, here is a graph, this turquoise line here, showing the rise and fall of private sector union density in the United States. Many of you have probably seen some version of that graph. We're now at a level in terms of private sector union density that goes all the way back to 1900. We haven't been that low since then. And as you can see, the total union density, and union density means the share of workers who belong to a union out of the total workforce. The total is pretty closely tracks the private sector, and that's because the private sector represents about 80% of all employment in the United States. So whatever's going on in the private sector basically dominates the overall trends for union density in the United States. You can see here that the public sector union density follows a radically different path from that of private sector. And if we had this line traced back further, it would show increase from basically from the mid-1960s. It would be pretty low, might be around between 5 and 10%. And then it would jump up and up till the point where it connects with the purple line that we have in this map, in this graph rather. And then it continues to escalate for another decade and then flattens out and just begins to, okay, so we're going to get into why that happened later. I'm not going to spend more time on it now. For now, we're going to look at the private sector and what's going on there. It's important to think for a moment about what union density represents. And what I want to say is that it is a rough measure of labor movement power. And by labor movement power, I mean both the economic power of unions to negotiate higher wages and working conditions and occupational safety and these things. And I mean political power, the capacity to influence legislation and policy in ways that are pro-worker. At the economic power level, there's really two aspects to that. Increasing power at the level of the firm, and at U of M, if Leo has 75% of all lecturers belong to Leo, we're a lot stronger union than if only 51% belong to Leo. At the sectoral level, if most of the workers in a sector like auto manufacturing, assembly are unionized, they're a lot more powerful than if only a third of the workers in that sector are organized. And I know that Cindy's going to talk more about that particular case, the auto sector. Political power-wise, there's at least 3 dimensions to it. Working class voter turnout is higher among union organized workers than those who don't belong to unions. Worker political consciousness is different. Workers are more likely to support pro-worker policies and parties. And the political parties themselves are pulled in the direction of labor if labor is more organized, not just left political parties like a Labor Party or a Social Democratic Party in other countries, but a Democratic Party will be pulled towards labor type issues if union density is higher than if it's not. It's important to understand that union density is not the only component of labor movement power. Others include mobilization capacity. We'll get into that a little bit when we get to some international comparisons. And a strategic capacity is important, but it's the one that's easiest to get your hands on. It's widely measured. There are lots of, so it's a good first approximation. And then if it doesn't quite do what you need it to do, you can supplement it with other ways of thinking about it. So here is our same union density map. It's in blue here, the line for the overall aggregate, which is, as we said, dominated by the private sector. But here's the red line is something new. This is the share of income going to the top 10% of the American population. And what you can see here is it's basically a mirror image of the union density line. And another way to think about that is there is a powerful inverse correlation between these two things. As one goes up, the other goes down. And so when union density is low in the 20s, in the sort of and prior period, the share going to the top percent is very high. As union density dramatically increases in the New Deal era and in the war years, and then flattens out, we see the share going to the top 10% fall and then stabilize. And as soon as union density begins to fall, the share that's going to that top 10% starts to rise again, to the point where it's now back to where it was in the 1920s. So this is a correlation rather than, and you can have correlations that do not have underlying causality to them. But in this case, it's not a coincidence. It's not an accident. It's a reflection of this question of power. And here's another way of looking at what's really going on behind those inequality numbers. In the first 30 years after World War II, when the labor movement was at its strongest politically and economically in the United States, that movement, through a variety of mechanisms, which I can go into in Q&A, but we don't really have time to go into in too great detail here right now, was able to align, was basically to use collective bargaining supplemented by political power to basically align wage compensation and productivity. So that in this period between 1945 and 1975, basically 1980, US productivity doubled. We were able to produce twice as much with the same amount of worker hours as we were at the beginning of that period. And over that period, because workers participated fully were fully compensated for that growth in productivity, wages or compensation in the United States, compensation means wages plus benefits, doubled as well. Home ownership of workers doubled. Everything doubled. Rising tide lifted all boats. All those metaphors you've heard were actually represented here in these two lines that track each other so closely for 30 years. And then it all falls apart. Basically, as union density gets below a certain threshold, the capacity of labor to maintain the institutions and the policies that generated those outcomes falls apart. This is the latter half of the 70s when this happens. And as it does, compensation basically flatlines, so that for this entire period since 1980, or even a little bit further back, if you want to track it back to the mid-70s, productivity growth has continued at the same rate it did for those first 30 years of the post-war period. If anything, it's accelerated a bit, but workers have participated in none of that. Even though they contribute to that productivity, they're the ones who do the work every hour of the day, every day of the week and year. their compensation has gone up only marginally. And for many years, it was flat. So again, I can get into more of exactly what these mechanisms were that generated this and why they fell apart when they did in the 30s, but in the 70s. But this is like this is why inequality grows so fast. Is because all of this money that's represented by the gap between hourly compensation trend and productivity trend is now going to the top 10%, and most of it to the top 1%, because labor ceased to be powerful enough to maintain those institutions. Now, if we go from historical trends of national aggregates to state by state look, we'll see the same basic pattern. What I got here is just borrowed from some UAW slides, actually, that Bob King sent me. So kudos to the folks who put those together. What you see here is our 50 states divided into 3 groups: low, medium, and high union density. The average union density in the low density ones, which are the dark blue. Mostly, you see the South is predominantly that, but there are other states as well. 5.8%. The lowest of them all, North Carolina, South Carolina, barely over 2%. Medium states in the green, and high states in the blue. Michigan is one of these high union density states. There are a total of 12 of them. There are 21 in the medium category and 17 in the low category. They're roughly equal population in these 3 categories: 114 million in high, 117 million in low, and 91. You see these diagonal lines in Michigan. There's a lot of them with diagonal lines. We are the only one that has diagonal lines among these high union density states. And that is because we are the only one of the high union density states that has right to work. And most of you know what right to work is, at least a little bit. I'm not going to go into it. It's an anti-union legislation that whenever labor is insufficiently strong to defend itself against ALEC and the corporate lobbies, push through right to work with a view to weakening primarily the bank accounts of the revenue stream of unions. So what we're going to look at is, okay, so what's the difference in terms of a series of things between high and low union density states? Here's one is wages. What's the average weekly wage? In the low union density states, it's $939 a week. In the high union density states, $1,140. A 21% difference between the lowest and the highest is the difference that the density makes there. In terms of the minimum wage, so looking at law now, not labor markets as regulated by law. Labor markets are influenced by policy too, of course, but looking directly at law, minimum wage law, the difference there is a 30% difference. If we look at the share of the unemployed who actually get unemployment insurance, there's a 100% difference. It goes from 20% of them that do in the low density states to 40% in the high. Still miserably low. 40% is not good, but it's double what it is in the low density states. If we look at educational investment per student, we see a 48, almost 50% difference there. And finally, if we look at, I gotta get this thing out of the way, the percent that are without health insurance, we see that only 7% are not covered in the high density states, almost double that in the low density states. So in all of these ways that impact individual well-being, union density makes a really big difference. Loretta, I thought I started a timer on myself when I began talking, and I'm just realizing it's not working. So can you tell me when we've hit about the 20-minute mark, or give me a 5-minute warning? How long have I been going on at this point?
You're about at 20 minutes.
Oh my goodness, really?
Yeah, but no, you're fine. We are early, so you're fine.
Okay, all right. Let me take
We're running on good time.
Let me take another few minutes then. Thanks, Loretta.
Yep.
I just wanted to make with this slide the point that it's the same story if we look at international comparisons as if we compare states within the United States. The countries with the highest union density, with the one exception of France, which we'll come back to, also have the highest level of tax revenues, so they charge higher taxes. They charge them in a more progressive way. And as a result, after you've raised those taxes and then redistribute them through social policies, you're able in the higher union density states, Sweden being the highest, to reduce poverty by 64% in the case of Sweden. In the case of France, 78, 70, 63, and then the lower union density countries, UK, Canada, and the USA, the impacts are still significant in terms of the impact of taxes and transfers on poverty levels, but a lot less than in the higher union density states. There's a lot of other kind of comparisons we could do, but those are, that's one that illustrates the general point of union density impacting how resources are distributed in societies. The French case is really interesting. I said before that union density is sometimes an imperfect measure, and that's true in France. It has the same union density as the United States. The difference between the labor movement power in the US and France is that if you've ever been to France, there's almost always a strike going on, if not multiple strikes. The level of collective action by labor in France is much higher. It's what we call in social movement literature like mobilization capacity. It's much, much higher in the French labor movement than the US labor movement. And that's better covered by a different measure called collective bargaining coverage. It doesn't vary much from 11 to 12 or 27 to 28. Within the Wagner Act type law legal system that governs labor relations in both Canada and the US, but it matters a lot in other countries. So basic story, international data show the same thing as the comparative state data. One last piece about union density and this time democracy. Look at this is the low, high, and medium to go back to the UAW. This is more UAW data. There's the 12 states, 21, 17 in each category. In 9 of the 17, there's been voter suppression laws passed since 2012. In not only 9 of 21 in the case of the medium density, and only 2 in the high density. So in other words, where unions are strong or the labor movement is strong, we're much more successful at resisting voter suppression laws. Similarly, with incarceration rates, it's 39% less people incarcerated per 1,000 in the 100,000 of population in the high density states than the low ones. Okay, why is this happening? A popular theory, Seymour Martin Lipset, a very famous political sociologist, is the best known exponent of this view, is that US is super individualistic country, and therefore individualistic people aren't interested in collective solutions to their problems and collective action and so on. Therefore, they don't really want to be in unions. Therefore, the reason we have lower union density in the US than in these other countries is that there's just less demand for it from workers. Here's data that have been collected since the mid-90s in response to this question. If you had the opportunity to vote for a union in your workplace tomorrow, would you vote for it? Back in and this is asked to workers who do not already belong to unions. Back in 1994, a third of the workers who were asked that question, national representative sample in the Northeast, said yes. And the numbers were similar, a little bit lower in the Midwest and the West. By 2018, here's what it looked like. There had been a 50% increase in the Northeast, 52%, 53, Midwest, almost 50% in the South, and 71% in the West. So at an annual rate of growth, the number of workers say they want to be in unions has been increasing in 3 of the 4 regions of the United States by a little over 2% a year, and in the West Coast by 3% per year. So you put it together, the workers that belong to unions already, the vast majority of whom want to remain in unions, it's about 11%. You then look at the number that want to be in unions but are not, is almost 50%. You get about 60% of American workers want to be in unions. That's like the Swedish number, right? That's union density in Sweden is 67%. We're not really very far behind the Swedes in terms of wanting to be in unions. Where we're way behind them is our capacity to turn desire into reality. Now, why is that? A second theory argues that it has to do with the changing structure of the economy. Sometimes globalization, economic globalization is invoked. Sometimes it's about the transition from a manufacturing sector dominated economy to a service sector dominated economy. And there's some truth to that, especially the second part, the service sector part. Well, also neoliberal globalization has had a negative impact on the manufacturing sector, especially. We all know what NAFTA and other manifestations of neoliberal globalization have had on the manufacturing sector in this state. The trouble is, though, that all the other countries have also undergone those kinds of changes. They've had similar structural changes. Service sector is a similarly large part of their economy. They've all been subject to neoliberal globalization. Indeed, many smaller countries are much more exposed to global trade than we are. They depend much more on global trade than we do. So that really isn't the main explanation either. The basic answer is pretty straightforward. And US employers have been willing and able to suppress worker rights much more effectively in the United States than they have than in other affluent capitalist democracies. Really, that kind of hostility to unions never ended in the South. It was been a continuous struggle. That's why union density has always been low and remains the lowest by far in the South. But in the mid-70s, from that point forward, it began to really, really grow in the rest of the country as well. And this graph gives you one way of measuring that. The number of people illegally fired because they were supporting a union organizing drive. You can see for the first 30 years of the post-war period, levels of firings only 14% of elections had one worker or more workers fired in an organizing campaign. But by the 1980s, it jumps to basically a third of all organizing drives have at least one worker fired. So I'm not going to go into why that increased so dramatically, but the effect of it is that it becomes a lot more difficult to win elections, certification elections. And the effect of that is unions have to even if they maintain the same level of investment in organizing as they did before, despite the fact that they're now getting worse results in terms of how many of these they can win, it's far more expensive to organize than it was before. And so what you see here is a dramatic decline in this dark blue line of the number of certification elections that are happening that unions are able to mount. The dotted line is what share of those they win. So that's the dotted line is over on the right-hand side. They start off in this period in 73, winning about 50%, a little less, and they're able to improve slightly the share that they win, but only because they're organized, they're running far less campaigns, and therefore they can put more resources into the much smaller number of campaigns they're still running. Well, if you run far fewer campaigns, you're going to not be able to keep up with the growth of non-union jobs that happens year after year as the economy grows, because the vast majority of new jobs that are created are non-union. So that's a big part of what's going on in the private sector. Public sector is a totally different animal in many ways. And I think because I've used up more time than we planned, I'm just going to stop here. And I think also I was going to say every presentation would end with Q&A, but I think since I've hogged more time than I should have, I would just go straight to Cindy Estrada, and maybe we can have Q&A after Cindy's presentation. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say there are a couple questions that
okay. All right. Well,
chat that.
All right.
And if anybody else has questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we will recognize you. But let me go back. Janet has a question. And she says, are you also considering the shift to financialization as a factor in income diversion to the top? Since 2008, rewards money flow have gone increasingly to those predatory finance industries. Do you see your question?
Yeah, well, I could give a quick answer to that. I think that the deregulation of the financial sector and the deregulation of a whole lot of things in the 80s and 90s, right, was something that labor fought against, but did not have the power to stop. You know, absent that deregulation, financialization as we know it today wouldn't have happened. So if you look at other countries where labor is a lot more powerful, like Sweden or even in Canada, the kind of deregulation that happened in the US that led to that huge skewing of the economy, of income in the direction of the financial sector, And also the meltdown that happened because it wasn't properly, derivatives and other kinds of activities in the financial sector were not properly regulated. They didn't happen in those countries because they never underwent that kind of deregulation. And they didn't undergo that kind of deregulation because labor and other progressive forces stopped it from happening.
Then Michelle Dietrich also had a question. Are the dollars for compensation versus production real dollars, inflation adjusted?
I'm pretty sure that that graph is inflation adjusted, yes. Yeah, because if you didn't inflation adjust it, the wages would have looked better. It's after you take account of inflation that you realize, man, wages haven't grown hardly at all for all that time period since the mid 70s. Yeah, so I'm 95% sure, Michelle, that that's inflation adjusted.
All right, I just want to say this is a great presentation, Ian. You got this information actually is so riveting, and thank you so much for providing us with this.